To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the Death Panel on Patreon and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, Abolish Rent, and Counting Like a State at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and I'm joined by returning guest and dear friend of the panel today, Vicky Osterweil. Vicky is a brilliant author, worker, and agitator. She is the author of the 2020 book, In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. She also writes about revolt, history, culture, anarchy, and technology as a founding member of CAW, which is a worker-owned anarchist journal of arts and culture. And her new book called The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World just came out recently from Haymarket. And it's really great. And we're going to be doing an episode on it very soon that I'm really excited about. But we had to do this first. I mean, they finally hit the crust of soft launching the new Red Scare. And we obviously had to have Vicky on to talk about it. So Vicky, welcome back to the show. I can't wait to get into this. There's so much here to get through today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind words and the introduction. It's so nice to be back and talking with the panel. And yeah, I mean, this is a truly it's a, on some levels it's very expected, but I think there's so much here in this document that is revealing. There's so much projection, even more maybe than usual. And there's also a lot of really, really bellicose and weird things being said. So I'm excited to get into it.
Yes, absolutely. And today we're talking about the Trump administration's recent announcement of a new global campaign against what it calls, quote, radical left terrorism. The Trump team just unveiled this initiative through a series of speeches laying out the administration's vision for confronting left movements framed under the auspices of confronting a national security threat. And so we're going to spend this episode really just closely reading those remarks and talking through what they're actually saying. So for folks that might have missed it, last week, the Trump administration convened representatives from more than 60 countries in Washington for what it called the Ministerial on the Resurgence of Political Terrorism. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, White House Deputy of Staff and Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller, and Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent used the occasion essentially to announce what they're saying is this global campaign against quote unquote radical left terrorism. And then the State Department also released nearly 100-page paper called Cuba, the Capital of 21st Century Communism, that then elaborates on this framing a couple of days later. So as I said, what we're going to do today is that Vicky and I are going to do a close read of the statements that Rubio and Miller made at the ministerial. We're going to cut Bessent for time, which I feel like is going to low-key hurt his feelings, and I like that. But really, it's just that his remarks didn't make the cut.
Yeah.
And I think before we get into the statements themselves, it's just worth slowing down for a second, because I think, what they're doing here is trying to establish a kind of global fascist working group almost, right? They're trying to persuade other states that the primary security threat of the coming years isn't, climate collapse or pandemic or the proliferation of violent far-right movements, but the revolutionary left. And I think more than that, they're also essentially inviting governments to coordinate around that premise, right? To align intelligence sharing and financial surveillance, border enforcement, policing, and prosecution of activists and diplomatic priorities around this kind of shared understanding of who the enemy is that centers specifically a kind of straw man of Marxism and anarchism. So I want to just sort of start with some top lines for me. One of the things that struck me going through these statements is actually they're a lot more ambitious than what they first appear. They're kind of ridiculous, and we're going to definitely be laughing a lot. But, they're not simply saying that, leftists have committed crimes or are violent, right? They are trying to enforce and almost revive a type of political common sense that targets the left. They're offering a theory of history, too, as well, and they're offering an explanation for why societies and nations and states are unstable and who is responsible for that instability that pushes towards the left as the source of that instability, which of course is incorrect. But But then it sort of is, again, about preserving and reinforcing the institutions that must be built to contain the left in order to, sort of make society safe, quote unquote. So, ultimately, like, it's an attempt to reorganize how people understand the world. And I think one of the reasons I was so excited to do this episode with you, because I don't think, either of us came to these speeches as strangers to this argument, right? In different ways, we've actually both spent years studying this exact political tradition and this exact framing. Health communism is, among other things, a history of how states learn to translate revolutionary demands for care into problems of security, right? Like the chapters Care and especially Cure that tell the story of the Socialist Patients Collective, or SPK, in West Germany, talks about how you can't understand the emergence of modern counterinsurgency without understanding the way that SPK was prosecuted in Germany and across the world. And that persecution of SPK was this kind of origin point for this whole grammar of quote unquote left-wing terrorism, and where it's a kind of entanglement of the idea of like psychiatry, revolutionary politics, and a kind of theory of political violence that essentially posits that left-wing terrorism, quote unquote, is like the most dangerous form of radicalism because we could never be satisfied within the framework of capitalism. And so that sort of frame coming back so explicitly, right, that we like write about in that chapter was, it was a little shocking, even though it was not unexpected. And your book, Vicky, In Defense of Looting, like performs, I think, a really similar intervention from a different direction, right? Like thinking through how categories like criminality, violence versus nonviolence, the idea of like a need for public order, public safety, are really sort of a way of actively constraining what constitutes political struggle and deciding what forms of collective action can, be translated into politics, or which are translated into like pathology or criminality or, terrorism in this case. And I think reading, Rubio and Miller's remarks, I kept thinking that these speeches, they aren't especially original, but
right.
What they're doing is they're really recycling this vocabulary with a very long history, asserting that history has kind of come full circle. And, I think what isn't new, obviously, is the theory and the framing, but in a lot of ways, what's new is the scale of the project that they're trying to announce and the confidence with which they're announcing it. So, I think you're going to probably hear some or see some coverage of this that's going to be like, this is an inaccurate description of the left. We're actually very calm and nonviolent, and those violent people over there are not us, or something like that. And I think what's more interesting is to talk about this very differently, to think about like how this question of like whether it describes the left or not is really beside the point. Like, we're not going to be fact checking today. We're going to be thinking about like, what are they doing here? What kind of like construction are they building, in terms of like an international security architecture, like what the kind of danger actually is to left movements by sort of being painted as this kind of particular kind of enemy. And I think one thing that, we've talked about for a long time is that like states don't really just like respond to enemies, right? They produce enemies as a form of governance, and they create categories that allow different struggles to be folded together under a sort of single rubric, making it possible to expand surveillance and policing and border enforcement, psychiatric incarceration, financial exploitation and criminalization. And again, this kind of like idea of international cooperation all at once. And I think these speeches are really fascinating, and I'm excited to close read them because you can actually watch that process and that kind of like argument be laid out step by step in real time. So those are like my top lines for why I'm interested in getting into it and sort of how I'm thinking about this. But what are your top lines, Vicky? Give me your takes. I want the takes. And then we're going to dive in and read it.
I think the thing that some of the things that sort of surprised me about it was how weak even their hysterical evidentiary apparatus is, but they actually really are refusing to talk about a lot of the things that actually happen. They're really, really scared of actually naming real left resistance. So they really focus on like the assassination attempts on Trump and Charlie Kirk, like none of which were carried out by leftists, which again, who cares? But I think and Luigi, obviously, which who's like whatever. So but again, that's one thing that I sort of found interesting. The other was that Marco Rubio really lays out in a really classical sense fascism, the theory of fascism. He doesn't call it that, obviously, but like he really openly names it a few times in a way that I find very. One time he's using it to describe the left, and one time he's using it to positively describe anti-communism. But in both instances, I think it's actually one of the most clear evocations we've ever gotten from anyone, including people like Miller, who are really openly and giddily fascistic. Another thing that's just a top line thing that I think people can think about as we go through this is that I think it really came into focus for me when that report on Cuba came out the next day, which is that, a project like this, a gathering like this of international, diplomats and leaders is months in the planning. And it sure feels like this conference was designed to arrive after the glorious conclusion of the Iranian campaign, allowing them to turn their attention to a war on Cuba, and that this war on Cuba was going to be sort of integrated into a sort of domestic and international repression of the left in general. And so there's a sort of very weird, like the document about Cuba, as a result, ends up feeling like it's really Marco Rubio's sort of personal bugbears as much as anything else, which all of these things always are to some extent. So I think like that if we think about it that way, I think there's also this sort of, there's a desperation to it that I think had the adventure in Iran gone the way they had hoped it would, might sound more powerful and more threatening and more accurate to the world, and has instead sort of like feels like just another piece of like sort of chaotic discourse from them on some level.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Absolutely. And there's so much that I want to jump in on, but I'm going to try and restrain myself because like if I'm not careful, we could talk about these statements for hours without ever actually like getting into the meat of what they say. So I think we'll just get right to close reading. What do you think?
Totally. No, that sounds right. Yeah, I think that's right.
So, the conference opens, Rubio is introduced and is the first speaker. And so we're going to start with Rubio and then we're going to do Miller, who came after him. And I'm going to read here for Rubio, and I'll try and capture like the vibe that he brought it to you. And we've abridged these comments slightly because there's certain like introductory, remarks that we don't need. And so the way that like Rubio's argument really starts is actually fascinating because he starts by essentially like defining the state. So he says, Rubio says, "Let me start by saying that the most essential duty of the state, the first responsibility, frankly, of any government of any kind, is the protection of its people, is the protection of its country. This is a sacred obligation that should transcend all political and ideological divisions. It is why, for example, we have militaries. It's why we have intelligence agencies. It's why counterterrorism bureaus exist, why police forces exist. Keeping our people safe is the reason why every country represented here has all of these things. We are all very well acquainted as of now, of course, by now with what has been described as traditional terrorist threats. For 25 years, the term counterterrorism, at least in the West, has meant first and foremost the fight against radical Islamist extremism. And there's a very poignant reason for that. On the 11th of September in the year 2001, 19 men murdered about 3,000 people here in my country. Then that same enemy struck Europe, murdering nearly 200 commuters aboard trains in Madrid in 2004 and 52 more aboard London buses and the underground in the following year. The entire architecture of Western counterterrorism was rebuilt from the studs around the singular traumatic event. That made sense at the time. Our job was to keep our people safe, and the realm of terrorism, the specter of global jihad, was the premier threat to their safety. And so we went to work and we assembled a global coalition, working with many of the friends that are represented here in this room today. And we destroyed the ISIS caliphate. We killed al-Baghdadi and al-Zawahiri and bin Laden, and we built intelligence and law enforcement systems capable of anticipating and stopping attacks before the public even hears about them. Every country here represented today has disrupted a terrorist threat at some point emanating from this source. So I'm going to stop here. This is like sort of the opening framing that Rubio brings in. And I think, you know, he kind of like telegraphs one of the main like ideological moves that is his entire speech, which he's like, you know, presenting the state as like a neutral protective force that sort of stands outside of society, looking down on threats, like identifying danger, keeping ordinary people safe. And, you know, then kind of has this overture of like, you know, we're going to tie this left-wing terrorism into, you know, the kind of changes that the state made in response to 9/11, you know, to target Islam globally. And this kind of framework of like making the state very neutral, right? And essentially sort of rewriting the entire history of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the U.S. role in that, right? Like in this one moment, like, you know, it like kind of frames it as, oh, well, we were compelled to do like the Patriot Act and bomb Baghdad and everything like that.
Yeah, I mean, the 9/11, like that move feels so ineffective now to like evoke 9/11. Like I sort of like when that happened, I sort of felt like, do you know that meme with the anime girl with like the champagne, like it was like 9/11 mentioned, you know?
Yes,
Like, that was like sort of the feeling of it. Like it was very perfunctory. And you know, I think it's really interesting that the position is like a claim of a victory, that they sort of won the war against jihadism, right? Like that's very much the claim that's made here, right? And I think like, you know, in the face of currently losing a war with what they would describe as the remnants of, you know, those forces in the, you know, in the Middle East, which of course we know are not particularly, you know, connected. But anyway, again, we're not fact checking it. You know, it's this really interesting moment of like trying to sort of claim that it was a reasonable and reasoned response to the 9/11 attacks and the terrorism threat that existed, and that it completely worked. And I think like both of those are like, you know, there's two, you know, leaps there that are, let's say, interesting. Productive for thinking through what's going on here. But yeah, I do think it's also really important that there is this attempt to evoke the emotional, the affect of the Bush era, you know, which is when Marco Rubio's star really began to rise, if I'm not misremembering. You know, to evoke that moment of affect, you know, and governance, and to sort of say we're sort of continuing this project and just refocusing it. It's pretty funny. It's pretty wild. I don't think I've ever actually heard anyone claim that we won the war on terror since Mission Accomplished in 2003, you know?
Which for our listeners who are too young to get that reference, yes. Which that's the thing I've realized is that there are a lot of younger people who like, you know, 9/11 is not seared in their brain the way that it is for, you know, a certain age of millennial, right? But famously, you know, Bush, in the middle of essentially having, you know, our ass handed to us, gets up on this like, I think it's like an aircraft carrier, right?
Yeah, he's in a flight suit. He comes in a flight suit in a fighter jet and lands on this aircraft carrier and jumps out and makes a speech in front of the giant banner that says "Mission Accomplished." And this is like right before the insurgency and the Sunni triangle really takes off. Like it's like literally like the one of the last moments where it seemed like maybe the U.S. had even potentially won something in Iraq. Really infamous moment. Yeah.
And we actually have referenced this a lot in 2021 when you had the Biden administration sort of declaring a premature victory over COVID, right? Which was we like reference the Mission Accomplished meme, which is just so like such a thing that I think it's just going to be burned in my brain until like, you know, my last two neurons fire. Which is just like, we referenced it and someone was like, what are you talking about? Laughing around Mission Accomplished. What do you mean? And I was like, oh, sorry, let me explain 2003 to you for a second. But, you know, it is exactly that. And I think what's important to remember, right, is that like states organize violence, right? They set up this dichotomy here between the state, this neutral protector, and, you know, forces that need to be controlled in order, you know, to protect the people, quote, I guess. And I think it's important to be real and remember the state does not like respond to violence, right? Like it organizes violence. It protects nothing and no one but itself, right? Even down to like deciding which harms even count as harms, right? And like what deaths count as preventable or already justified to begin with, right? Already sort of, deaths pulled from the future. What kinds of suffering and need are emergencies? What kinds are simply the normal conditions of life and cannot be changed, right? And states have a very particular way of seeing. I'm not trying to like personify states and make them sound like a person, right? But it is a complex system that relies on taking in information, digesting a certain parameter for understanding what that information means, and then producing a systematic reaction and response, right? So that's what I mean when I say like states have a way of seeing, right? They simplify very complex social worlds and conditions into categories that can be easily measured and administrated and controlled. And the state, needs the world to become legible. You need essentially the simplification in order for governance to work for a state. And this is really what Rubio is sort of doing in this paragraph, is that he's not just like describing like the conditions as he sees them. He's preparing, the world to join in on this administrative counterinsurgency against the left by invoking this particular way of sort of seeing the idea of sort of global jihad as threatening like Western world order or whatever. And saying, so that this is what we've done in that context, right? And this is the way we see that problem. And we're going to introduce a whole host of other things that essentially, he's making this translative like gesture, right? That he thinks by sort of invoking 9/11, right? Like they can invoke the same approach being necessary towards, their framing of radical left terrorism. And this is, again, the kind of like administrative simplification that the state really runs on, right? And he's sort of creating the conditions where, again, like this category of danger becomes like always already accepted as real, right? And the state cannot govern without identifying like enemies, right? Without identifying threats that justify the expansion of its own capacities. And this is why like, abolitionists in particular like spend so much time challenging the idea that like safety or protection is something that's delivered by police and prisons and militaries and borders, intelligence agencies, right? The point is not that like violence is imaginary, right? It's that the state has this very selective relationship to violence, and it's extraordinarily attentive to certain types of violence and harm, and treats others as real like background noise.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.